WeChat and TikTok have now been officially banned in the United States on the grounds of national security concerns. Also, China is planning to construct hundreds of new airports. Behind this move is something deeper, and it may give us insight into the true state of the Chinese economy. I'll be going in depth into this. Also, I'll be interviewing Bruce Klingner about the US-Japanese alliance and what still needs to be done, so stay tuned for that. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. President Donald Trump's administration will block Americans from downloading China-based applications WeChat and TikTok, citing national security concerns. The ban will go into effect starting on Sunday. U.S. Department of Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said in a statement that, quote, "Today's actions prove once again that President Trump will do everything in his power to guarantee our national security and protect Americans from the threat of the Chinese Communist Party." Now, when it comes to this move is being praised and criticized depending on which side of the aisle you're on. The Chinese Communist Party, through these programs, is able to push propaganda to Americans. There have been many cases of this. And on this show as well, we talked about how different Communist Party cadres work in these companies in China. The CCP does have direction over them, although it's a complicated situation when it comes to the structure. On the note of TikTok, meanwhile, Oracle is working on buying up the company, but that move is also being criticized because it's unclear how much influence the CCP will still have in that deal. So we'll have to see how this unfolds. In other news, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared that, quote, "the tide has turned" when it comes to international perceptions of the CCP. His statements were from a September 15 event with the Atlantic Council. It summarized his speech, noting that many countries are now rethinking their reliance on China. Pompeo said the Trump administration has been advising these countries on China using, quote, "just facts" about what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to their people and to their country.
Just facts about what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to their people and to their country, and to the threats that it poses to their sovereignty.
He said many countries are seeing the way the Chinese regime covered up the CCP virus, the way it has taken advantage of Africa with their unfair investment deals, and said among other countries in the Asia-Pacific region, quote, "attacks on their economic activity inside their own resource zones are things that they have the capacity to stand up to, so long as America is prepared to do it alongside them." Going forward, he said, the types of deals and engagements countries have with China will reflect these understandings. So what are we seeing here? The Chinese Communist Party is losing the war of perception. And this is important. When it comes to military positioning, oftentimes there are two different main battles. There's the war of bullets and there's the war of words. There is your ability to fight, the strength of your military, and there's also the spirit or the willingness to fight. When it comes to the CCP, it is losing the spirit battle. It is losing the perception battle. The ideas that form its different influences and that form its perceptions around the world, all of these are eroding away right now. Without that type of support, other countries will not align with the CCP. Without that type of support, other businesses will not go to China. Without the type of support, other countries would be more willing to stand up against the CCP, and on this note, to align more with the United States. So again, the CCP is losing the battle that will decide the outcome of what's taking place right now, which is, again, the war of perception. Also, the Chinese Communist Party banned pork imports from Germany on September 12th after it confirmed a case of the swine flu. According to Reuters, Germany supplies about 14% of China's pork, and the move is expected to be a major blow to German pork suppliers, while also pushing up the market for suppliers in the United States. And this ties to China interests as well. Now, it just happens that one of the major pork suppliers in the United States is Smithfield Foods, which is a subsidiary of a publicly traded Chinese corporation, Shuanghai International. Another major U.S. pork supplier is Tyson Foods, which has maintained close ties to the CCP as well. Now, you might remember Democratic Senators Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker opened an investigation into Tyson Foods, JBS USA, Cargill, and Smithfield Foods in June, after the companies had warned Americans they could face meat shortages. You might remember, right? There was talk about meat shortages in the United States. It turns out at the same time they were saying that these companies were making record shipments to China of meat. So the question is, why were they telling Americans there'd be meat shortages while they were making record meat shipments to China? Democratic senators are looking into this. Now, President Trump had kept the meat supplies going in the United States after he signed an executive order that had designated their operations as critical infrastructure. He was, of course, criticized for that, but it did keep the meat supplies going in the U.S. Now, when it comes to China and this recent deal with Germany, when it comes to blocking their shipments, this is likely retaliation against Germany, or at least it will be interpreted like this. Now, Angela Merkel in Germany has taken a stronger stance against the CCP. In Germany, really, once they start getting going, they don't stop. It's part of their culture, part of their nature. When it comes to them standing up against the CCP, they often are slow going, but once they have momentum, they typically stick with it. And the momentum right now is to break away from the Chinese Communist Party, and Germany's influence within the EU is also major as well. Germany moving away from the CCP, calling out the CCP, very likely will pull the EU along with it. And this is important now as well, because if the CCP is retaliating, rather than trying to engage on friendly terms, very likely this will have the opposite effect. Very likely Germany now will look for other markets for its meat and also will move further away from the CCP. And this also points to something else that's interesting. The Chinese Communist Party owns major food companies in other countries. The CCP has major control over food industries in other countries, including the United States. Again, this ties into one of the big questions as well. How can the CCP use this strategically? Will this be perceived as the CCP using its control over these meat companies strategically when it comes to this? Very likely, again, this could bring the attention of the United States in addition to what's happening. So we'll see how this unfolds and we'll keep you updated on it. Meanwhile, Speaker of the House, Representative Nancy Pelosi, condemned the violence and looting in the riots that have spread across the United States. She said on the House floor on September 17th,
"We support peaceful demonstrations. We participate in them. They are part of the essence of our democracy. That does not include looting, starting fires, or rioting. They should be prosecuted. That is lawlessness."
Her statements were met with mixed responses. Some individuals supported her for saying this, some also criticized her for doing this too little, too late. Now, you might remember many Democrats and news personalities had previously defended or excused the riots. Now, what does this really show us? Well, if you ask me, I'd say this is a major step when it comes to the Democrats disavowing the extreme left. Many people on the extreme left do not support their party candidate. They do not support Biden. Epoch Times had reporters on the ground at some of these riots. These individuals will not vote for him. They do not support him. Polling data, different people have cited this, shows that these riots are causing the opposite effect. They are not in the interests of the Democrats. The Democrats disavowing the extreme left and moving back to their roots of classical liberalism, in my analysis at least, may be the best move for them. This does suggest, at least from Pelosi, that may be the trajectory, that may be what they're trying to do. We'll have to see how this works, though, because, again, they encouraged these protests for so long that it's hard for them now to distance themselves from it. And also there's a difference in, say, political viewpoints when it comes to Pelosi's views on this, as we're seeing at least right now, and what a lot of the big media are promoting that are mainly in favor of the Democrats. But it also shows a level of cohesion within the party, especially when local prosecutors are letting rioters off the hook. Can Pelosi maintain unity within the Democratic Party when there are different factions with different interests? Again, you might remember what happened to the Republican Party. The Trump administration early on was facing also the same divisions of interests. The party culture changed. You did have the alt-right in the Trump administration. Now, during the Charlottesville incident, it was controversial, yes. When the far left and far right were clashing with each other on the streets, you had an individual hit and kill someone with a car. Trump said there were good people on both sides. He was criticized for that. But the broader context, he also said there were bad people on both sides. And in that statement, he disavowed the far right. Now we see Pelosi possibly doing the same thing by disavowing the far left. And again, this may be a necessary step in terms of bringing balance back to these parties. We'll have to see how this unfolds. And now for the broader stories for today. Now, first up, the CCP is making a new push for logistic systems to stabilize China's supply chains, with planned projects including the construction of hundreds of new airports. Yet behind this move is something deeper, and it may give us another hint at the true state of the Chinese economy. On September 9th, CCP leader Xi Jinping spoke at the 8th meeting of the Central Committee of Financial and Economic Affairs and said, according to the state-run news agency Xinhua, that building these systems should be treated as a critical strategic mission. She also said that this would be indispensable to the regime's push in development. Now, in more practical terms, Xi is claiming the construction of new infrastructure projects such as high-speed rail lines, airports, warehouses, so on. He's saying these are an essential focus. And already the CCP appears to be moving forward with this. Now, looking just at airports, in 2019 there were an estimated 235 airports in China. And CCP officials believe this will grow to around 450 airports over the next 15 years. South China Morning Post reported in March that the CCP was on an apparent, quote, binge of constructing airports, but noted this is despite signs that air traffic is slowing, not growing. So again, why are they building airports and doing this big infrastructure push if it's slowing down, not growing? This is not meant to, say, take pressure off of growth. As far as the plans go, much of this will be built in the Yangtze River Delta region, the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei region, and the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau Greater Bay Area, as well as Chongqing City and Chengdu City. But if the growth isn't there to justify all this new construction, then what's the purpose? Well, this ties into one of the CCP's major fallback economic programs, pouring funds into technically useless construction projects in order to artificially stimulate economic growth. This is why, for example, the CCP has been building ghost cities, these sprawling, massive construction projects where almost nobody lives and few people use. The idea is that the construction of infrastructure helps raise the Chinese GDP, particularly at a time when the Chinese economy has been hit with the CCP virus and by companies pulling the supply chains out of the country. At the same time, Xi Jinping also does apparently view China's current logistics sector as something slowing down development. But realistically, could advancements in transporting goods make much of a difference? Well, we can look at a few factors in this. When it comes to the CCP using infrastructure projects to stay afloat, it has already become overly dependent on this when it comes to artificially inflating its GDP. It has kept up this practice on a massive scale as well. New York Times reported back in 2017, for example, on an Oxford University study that said less than a third of 65 Chinese highway and rail projects that were reviewed were, quote, genuinely economically productive. Again, that means most of them were not economically productive. The rest, it was determined, actually created more debt. The study warned that if the projects weren't reined in, then the poorly managed investment in infrastructure could cause a financial crisis in China. But for the CCP, artificial projects like this have become a key element in the lifeblood of its economic plans. The idea is simple. Each bridge or railroad can cost billions of dollars and create jobs for hundreds of workers for several years. And this is also more than just construction workers. It includes factories, transportation, and other jobs related to the overall project. Again, the entire Chinese infrastructure when it comes to manufacturing. And mega projects like these, which pool their funding from government-issued national debt, are among the key drivers of China's economic growth. Between 2014 and 2019, the CCP spent around $70 billion on ground infrastructure and on projects just to upgrade their air traffic control systems for airports. But in addition to the growing debt and also the long-term issue that these projects end up becoming a debt burden over the course of time, the projects bring along other issues as well, mainly when it comes to government corruption. This is again one of the more serious problems they have. Since the projects usually get their funding from loans by state-owned banks, which in turn go to companies that are typically state-run, this ties directly to local governments that in turn run the businesses and also are in charge of paying back the loans. To pay them back, they often use tolls and other methods. But as a way to make more money for themselves, CCP officials often tack on additional parts for the projects, which bring them in more cash, but also makes the resulting infrastructure overpriced and puts them deeper in debt. And profits from the tolls often then fall short of covering the ongoing costs, let alone paying back the loans themselves. But regardless of these issues, the CCP is showing no signs of stopping with this practice, and even its Belt and Road Initiative of constructing infrastructure projects in countries outside of China, often using deceptive debt traps, has also been accused of being little more than an extension of the CCP's practice of using empty and unprofitable construction to inflate its GDP. And now tying this back when it comes to Xi's recent statements on building more for China's logistics sector, this will have little impact when it comes to stopping companies from pulling out of China. Many are pulling out over national security and diplomatic concerns or related issues, and the CCP creating better systems for transportation and storage are not likely to change this. And even more so, it won't be able to fix the nuances of the problems of China's domestic companies and things they're facing right now. For example, the US placing crippling sanctions on Chinese telecom company Huawei that will prevent it from buying chips that are crucial for making its projects. Better airports and transit lines will not help with that. So again, when it comes to the current state of the Chinese economy, if upgrading these logistical systems won't do much to fix the economic issues the CCP is facing, the real issues, then why is Xi Jinping pushing for it, even stating that it should be treated as a critical strategic mission? Well, again, the Chinese economy is in a difficult situation, and the CCP has for more than a decade at least used projects exactly like this to keep its economy running artificially. Very likely again, following the same pattern, this is likely the CCP pushing for the construction of mega projects on a large scale, massive scale, in order to artificially halt the downward slide of the country's GDP. And there are also a few other key elements to this. The ruling Communist Party's model for economic growth is based on systems of cheating and stealing. We can look, for example, to its use of intellectual property theft, its building of brittle buildings in China, where corners have been cut to save money. These are mockingly called tofu buildings by Chinese netizens. Its use of debt traps against other countries to gain control of infrastructure in these countries. Its use of slave labor, for example, in Xinjiang and elsewhere. And its lack of basic protections that erode any personal motivations for innovation or creativity. So what does this all mean? All of these systems are now being targeted by the West, by the United States very heavily, for example. And this means that all the bricks at the foundation of the CCP's economic programs are being pulled out from under them one by one. In order to save itself, the CCP would need to end these practices and take a legitimate path. But the CCP cannot fundamentally change its nature. It cannot do this without risking the collapse of the CCP itself. And so again, changing the CCP fundamentally, changing the nature of the CCP in order to meet these requirements, would mean ending the CCP and its basic way of operating. It would mean changing the nature of the Communist Party. The problem China faces isn't a broken logistics sector. The problem is the fundamental nature of the Chinese Communist Party. And in other news in China, given the state of internet censorship overall, Senator Cory Gardner, a Republican from Colorado, has introduced legislation meant to counter internet censorship, particularly from the Chinese Communist Party. The bill is called the Free the Internet Around the Globe to Hack, Tyranny, and Censorship Act, or the Fight Censorship Act. It would establish a clear U.S. policy on internet freedom and would require the National Telecommunications and Information Administration under the Department of Commerce to communicate the U.S. policy on internet freedom to other countries around the world. Gardner said in a press release this would help U.S. actions to promote democracy and defend human rights, and would, quote, continue to hold bad actors like the Chinese Communist Party accountable for censorship and violations of basic human freedoms. Now, when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party's different forms of censorship, one of the main ones is the Great Firewall. When it comes to breaking through these systems, this has mostly been a grassroots effort. There are different organizations, different individuals, and different human rights operations to help people break through the firewall. Some of these programs have received a little bit of government funding, but really for the most part they're grassroots. If the U.S. government were to give funding to these operations, very likely this would mean the creation of large-scale programs that could really help people fully break through the firewall. And if that happened, it would mean the CCP's hold on ideological control in China would take a major blow. And if that happened as well, that would mean a destabilization of the CCP and its narratives, because the Chinese people then would be able to get information from outside of China uncensored and see the nature of the CCP and the types of information that it's been hiding from them. In other news, the new Quad alliance formed between the United States, Japan, India, and Australia is working to stand up against the Chinese Communist Party. According to Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow on Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation, Japan in particular may need a bit more of a push to reach its full capabilities. And when it comes to standing up against the CCP, this may be necessary. He argues the issue Japan faces is not its defense capabilities, but instead different policies that lend to a hesitancy to deploy them. To get a better sense of this, we've invited Bruce Klingner to speak with us. We'll jump into this now. Bruce Klingner, it's great having you on Crossroads.
Thanks very much for having me.
So I understand now we're seeing an interesting situation with Japan, where it had, of course, this policy for a long time to not really engage in defensive or offensive capabilities. It changed that as China began pushing into the East China Sea, and now we see it joining this Quad alliance with the United States, Australia, and India. But you're saying that Japan has a bit of a ways to go when it comes to the internal politics on its willingness to engage in the conflict. Can you explain this to us?
Japan has a very large military, or as they say, self-defense force, but it's constrained by a number of things, including its constitution and very constrained interpretations of it, of what the Constitution allows it to do. So on the defense of the country itself, it works in conjunction with the U.S., but is taking an increasingly large responsibility. But on pushing Japan to do regional or even global issues, the U.S. has long been frustrated in trying to get Japan to do more. And so under Prime Minister Abe, he delivered on a number of promises that Japan had been making for decades. But even then, it was very difficult for the U.S. to get Japan to do what they wanted. So Japan is facing increasing incursions into its territorial areas by China. So in recent years, it has been much more willing to confront China, but still there are a number of issues beyond its regions that the U.S. is hoping Japan will do more.
Well, it's an interesting history on it too, because if we remember before China began its push into the East China Sea and the conflicts around the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, Japan was talking about pulling out U.S. military bases from Japan. There was a lot of controversy around them. It was very contentious. After these hostilities started, they basically told the United States, okay, you guys can stay. We like you here now. We saw that kind of develop now, where it does seem that Japan is more concerned about direct threats from China, and because of that, they seem more willing to listen to the United States and more willing to cooperate openly with the U.S. on military, operations. I think the Quad alliance is a huge development in that. And based on what you're saying, I'm curious, how willing do you think Japan would be to listen to the United States when it comes to even, something as drastic, I think, as reforming their constitution when it comes to defensive capabilities or offensive capabilities?
Well, under Prime Minister Abe, they did implement a number of changes, one of which was changing its interpretation of what's called collective self-defense. Prior to that decision in 2015, 2016, if a U.S. ship was in Japanese waters defending against incoming North Korean missiles, but a North Korean submarine was about to torpedo that U.S. ship, a Japanese ship couldn't engage with that North Korean torpedo or that North Korean submarine in order to defend a U.S. ship. Or another example is if a U.S. soldier and a Japanese soldier were in Iraq on a UN peacekeeping operation, and the U.S. soldier came under fire, the Japanese soldier could not respond because it would be more than protecting himself, it'd be protecting others. Under Abe's reinterpretation, now Japan can do more to protect those countries that are protecting Japan or overseas, but is still very reluctant to stay engaged in UN peacekeeping operations if things become dangerous. So with the growing China threat to Japan, Tokyo has stepped up. It's procuring new weapons. It's creating new units, an amphibious brigade to engage. So it's looking for U.S. assistance, but on engaging China, it is willing to do more on its own behalf.
Well, and we're seeing interesting shifts now with Japan as well, following this virus outbreak, where Japan was paying companies to pull out of China when it comes to its supply chain. Japan and India were doing this. And, previously, a lot of my work has been investigating Chinese subversive operations in different countries. I know that Japan, because of business interests, because of security concerns, they were pretty hesitant when it came to calling out the CCP strongly. I think that changed over time a bit because of the incursions in the East China Sea. But given the breakaway on the economic side as well, because, oftentimes in Australia, Japan, pretty much the same situation, the business side, the government side, they're a little more diplomatic with China, but the military hawks tend to be a bit stronger. Given the situation now where the businesses are pulling out and there's less interest in terms of economic ties, do you see this changing? Because I think what you're getting at is the political arms that are kind of holding back the military side. Is this accurate? And I guess, how do you see this changing?
Right. Well, another thing we saw under Abe was the initiative of the Quad as well as the free and open Indo-Pacific, two ideas that the U.S. have incorporated, but really came from the initiative of Abe. So now that we're having a change in leadership in Japan with Mr. Suga, the former chief cabinet secretary, we're wondering to what degree he may change or not implement as vigorously some of Mr. Abe's initiatives, such as the Quad or the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. When it comes to China, Japan has, like many countries in the region, has sort of been balancing its security and diplomatic concerns with its economic collaboration or engagement with China. So right now, the Trump administration is pushing for a very strong, really anti-China coalition with the idea of sort of you're with us or you're against us. And Japan, South Korea, others don't really want to make it that stark a difference. So Mr. Abe has pushed for a diversification away from China, changing the supply chains, but they're not really willing to go as far as the Trump administration is looking for of totally pulling out of China or totally cutting off engagement with China or really trying to contain China. So the U.S. has its work cut out for it in trying to balance the security, the cyber, the political, the diplomatic concerns with other nations' needs to engage with China economically.
Now, again, when it comes to Abe stepping down and this Mr. Suga stepping in as leader of Japan, I'm curious what your assessment is on Mr. Suga's position on China, whether he'll be as hawkish as Abe and is willing to position himself alongside Donald Trump, because I know that there's also political issues with that as well. What's your assessment on his position on the CCP and his position on Trump?
Right. Well, Mr. Suga was chief cabinet secretary or sort of like a chief of staff for the 8 years of the Abe administration. So he's been very involved with policy, but more on the implementation side. So many have questions as to how different he'll be, whether he'll change policies or just perhaps not be as vigorous. He's indicated that he knows he's not the diplomat or the person on the world stage as Abe was. So he said he'll even consult with Mr. Abe on foreign policy. So we're unsure, and that's a big question as to how different will Japan's policies be under this new leader. Will Japan sort of throw around its weight as much as under Mr. Abe? I think, though, throughout Japan, the leadership circles, there's the concern about China, not only the military incursions, but certainly its behavior during COVID, covering that up, and its expansionist policies in not only the South China Sea but the East China Sea. So I think there's a pervasive concern or distrust of China in the Japanese leadership circles, but we'll have to see how that plays out under a new administration.
Now, that said, folks, we're again broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Also, if you want to support us, please consider joining us on Patreon. You can find the link to our Patreon page in the description below. If you haven't already, also, please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. It really helps us grow. And as I mentioned before, if you want to really support us, if you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads and consider sharing this video. With that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.